just to give you a hint of who we will be listening to, Professor Roberan is a professor of ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at Stockholm School of Theology, so the University College Stockholm. He's originally from Ukraine, where he began his studies, in theoretical physics before moving to the study of theology and the Theological Seminary and Academy in Kiev. He continued theological education at my home country, National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, and Durham University then in the UK, where he defended his PhD under the supervision of Professor Andrew Lau. The topic of his thesis was related to post-Chalcedonian Christology. Now, Professor Oberon taught theology in a number of confessional and public institutions. Briefly, I will name Kiev, Moscow, Minsk, Kiev Mohila Academy in Kiev, Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and others. He was a research fellow at Yale and Columbia University in the US, a visiting professor at the University of Münster, and international fellow at the Chester Running Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta in Canada. He has given a very long list of guest lectures across the globe, and he holds membership of a number of professional associations, including the American Academy of Religion, the European Academy of Religion, Association for the Sociology of Religion, International Association of Patristic Studies, Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, North American Patristic Society, International Academic Forum in Japan, Ukraine Patristic Society, and the list is long, Research Network for New Directions in the Humanities, International Society for Neoplatonic Studies. So it is a great honor and pleasure to have you, Professor. And for the next hour, we hope to be able to benefit from your expertise under the title of the Minefields of the Religious Landscape in Ukraine. Do you need to share a PowerPoint or?
Not really. I'll be talking.
We can't hear you. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I don't need any PowerPoint. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'll be just talking. First of all, thank you for this invitation. I'm sorry that I cannot be with you physically. I have kind of a collision of different events, and I'm talking currently from Sweden. What I'd like to share with you is an overview of the kind of a big picture of the socio-religious landscape, so to say, of Ukraine. And I will start very early, with the formation of the people of Ukraine. My first, my departure point is the 10th century in the state which was called Rus, which was one of the most powerful European states that covered vast territories from Black to White Seas. When its people received baptism in the end of the 10th century, they were incorporated to the what has been called Byzantine political commonwealth, which was essentially the Roman Commonwealth, but later on it was called the Byzantine. And its church, the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Kiev became a metropolitan center under the Church of Constantinople. Well, Rus was huge but politically unstable. It began rapidly declining in the 12th century. Prince Andrei of Vladimir pillaged Kiev in 1169. In 1240, you see, I go really back into the ages, to the centuries. In 1240, the city was captured and burned down by the Mongols. It did not reemerge as a significant center of political power until early modernity. The dramatic political decline of Kiev incurred dramatical changes to the church connected with it. The Kievan metropolia became divided into two parts. Well, I'm going to be dense on facts and historical events, but because many of you are from Ukraine, I see you. I think and I hope that you will be able to navigate through it. And if you have any question regarding those dance facts and events, just let me know. So the Kievan Metropolia became divided into two parts. These parts aligned themselves with two states that had emerged from Rus and claimed their succession to it. In the southwest, it was the Principality of Galicia, Volhynia, and in the northeast, the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland absorbed the former in the 14th century. The Grand Duchy of Moscow did the same to the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal. So these two duchies became rivals and tried to appropriate the Metropolia of Kiev. What happened to this metropolitan result can be presented as kind of cloning of the Kievan See. So we could say that the Church of Kiev became like cloned into two parts. One clone, so to say, in quote marks always, emigrated to the southwestern Rus. Galich, which is in present Ukraine, Novgorodok in present Belarus, and Vilno in present Lithuania became new residencies of the Kievan metropolitans. The primates of the other clone, the second one, were first hosted in Vladimir upon Klязьма and then ended up in Moscow. With the growth of political and military strength of Moscow, it began seeking its own autocephalous church, meaning its independency from Constantinople. Eventually, it found an opportunity to proclaim ecclesial independence after the Church of Constantinople participated in the Council of Basel, Ferrara, Florence in the 15th century. The independence of a part of the Church of Kiev, which had its center in Moscow, was a political step initiated and conducted by civil authorities. Constantinople did not recognize the unilateral proclamation of its autocephaly. This led to the schism between Moscow and Constantinople. Well, we talk a lot about schisms nowadays, and especially Moscow, has instrumentalized the rhetoric of schism in order to accuse, Ukraine and to put some additional blame on Ukraine. But actually, the Church of Moscow started with a schism with Constantinople. This schism was resolved only in 1589, after the Patriarch of Constantinople, Jeremiah II, visited Moscow. There, he recognized the autocephaly of the Russian Church and gave it its patriarchal status. Constantinople proclaimed autocephaly and patriarchal status of only one of the two parts of the original Metropolia of Kiev. The other part remained faithful to Constantinople, and it was contained mostly within the confines of the Lithuanian Polish state, which is known as Rzeczpospolita. Towards the end of the 16th century, this state, in collaboration with Rome, initiated the process of, what is called Uniatism. A third clone of the Metropolia of Kiev was created, this time in unity with Rome. So there are like three clones of the same church that existed under Constantinople. One was appropriated by Moscow, somehow even hijacked by Moscow. Then the second one found its place allocation in Rzeczpospolita, and the third one emerged again in Rzeczpospolita, but now in unity with Rome. This happened at the council in Brest, now in Belarus, in 1596. The advance of Unia urged the autonomous Ukrainian state, ruled by hetmans and accountable to Rzeczpospolita, to seek solutions to the church issue in Moscow and Constantinople. Constantinople, in addition to this, was motivated by the ongoing war between Lithuanian Polish kings with the Ottoman sultans. And Crimea was involved in this war, by the way, as a footnote. So Crimea has been always like a part of this story. Moscow, after signing political union with the Ukrainian hetmans in Pereyasliv in 1654, sought for more dependence of Ukraine in both political and ecclesiastical terms. Conflation of the interests of Ukrainian hetmans, Moscow Tsars, and the ecumenical patriarchs led to the decision of the latter to transfer to the Moscow Patriarchate some rights over that part of the Kievan Metropolia which remained faithful to Constantinople. However, Moscow interpreted this concession of Constantinople as a license to annex the remaining part of the Kievan Metropolia. This part was absorbed by the Moscow Patriarchate and remained under its control until the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917. After the Tsar abdicated, Nicholas II, new nations emerged from the Russian Empire, including the Ukrainian nation. The Ukrainians established their own republic, which lasted until 1921, when it was replaced by the dictatorship of the proletarians and absorbed by the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian Republic was democratic in its nature and cultivated both ethnic identity and socialist ideas. The rise of national, well, at least in the kind of initial part of its existence, it was clearly socialistic. The rise of national self-awareness among the Ukrainians brought back their historical memory that they once belonged to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. In 1917, many Orthodox Ukrainians decided to have their independent church. They were backed by the Ukrainian government at the time, which engaged with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. It was especially in the second period of the Ukraine Republic and the Directoria. The Patriarchate, however, failed to meet the Ukrainian demands. Essentially, the Ukrainian government sent its ministries, its epigones to Constantinople. Constantinople just did not respond, did not collaborate. This did not, however, stop the autocephalist movement in Ukraine. An all Ukrainian Church Council gathered in January 1918 and endorsed autonomy as a form of semi-independence of the Ukrainian Church from the Russian Church. Another church council, which was convened in October 1921, proclaimed autocephaly and established the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. This church, however, did not receive support of bishops, in the Orthodox Church as it is in the Catholic Church. The church business is run by bishops, and you cannot have a church without bishops. And that's exactly what was the problem of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church. And being unable to find bishops, it was unable to choose a primate, to choose the main person in charge of the church. Therefore, this church decided to elect a married priest, Vasily Lipkivsky, who was consecrated not by other bishops but by clergy. Well, this is quite imaginable, in the Lutheran context, but it's rather unimaginable in the Catholic or Orthodox context. As a result of that, bishops and priests who received their ordination from these consecrations became known as samosvyati, literally the ones that have consecrated themselves. This church continued to exist in the first years of the Soviet regime. In around 1930, the communist state exterminated it. Only parts of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church survived in the immigration, mostly in the United States and Canada. There, its hierarchy was reconsecrated. So this hierarchy was restored. As an ecclesial structure, however, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church remained unrecognized by other local Orthodox churches. So this lack of recognition seemed to be like a doom for the autocephalist projects of the Ukrainians. Only in 1990 did the Ecumenical Patriarchate embrace the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church in Canada, and in 1995 the same church in the United States. In 1991, Ukraine was proclaimed an independent state and the Ukrainian Republic was restored. Like in 1917, it immediately began setting up an autocephalous church. This time, however, the Ukrainians did not have to establish a new autocephalous church, but invited back the church that existed in North America. The Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church was replanted, so to say, in Ukraine under the leadership of Mstislav Skripnik. Mstislav was proclaimed the first Patriarch of Kiev in 1990 and enthroned at St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev. This proclamation, however, was not recognized by other local Orthodox churches. In 1992, Mstislav allowed the merge of his church with the structures created by the former Metropolitan of Kiev, Filaret Denisenko. Filaret had occupied the Episcopal See of Kiev since 1966 as an exarch. Probably most of us have been born after he became the exarch of Kiev. So he's like from the prehistoric times there. This title presupposed some degree of formal independence for the church. It did not, however, translate to more Ukrainian features in the exarchate, as Filaret personally opposed them. So it was like a paradox that on the one hand the exarchate of Ukraine under Filaret featured some kind of independence, but Filaret personally at that time was very much against it, against any sort of independence. Well, he changed, of course, after Ukraine became independent. And this happened after 1990, after the death of the Patriarch of Moscow, at the time Pimen. Filaret then was elected the locum tenens, meaning the holder of the patriarchal position in Moscow. He was not, however, elected Patriarch and lost elections to Alexei Ridiger, known as the Patriarch of Moscow, Alexei II. Filaret returned to Kiev, where he continued as an exarch. Having realized how Ukraine was rapidly heading to its independence from Russia, Filaret initiated a similar process in the church. He urged the Ukrainian bishops to sign a petition to Patriarch Alexei with the request to grant the Ukrainian church even more independence. The request was satisfied when the Council of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church on October 25-27 in 1990 granted to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and, as they call it, independence in management. This was a kind of a newly created status to satisfy somehow, the Ukrainian desire for independence. On the other hand, to make it very, very undefinable, the status of the Ukrainian church. So it would not be identifiable with either autocephaly or autonomy, two statuses of independence known in the Orthodox world. It's important to understand the difference between like the confirmed autocephaly, confirmed autonomy, and a vague, self-proclaimed semi-independence, which doesn't fit neither of those kind of categories. It's important to understand the difference between them because it will help us to understand the current status of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate now, these days. Anyways, let's go back, before we come back to our days, let's go back to 1991, when Ukraine was proclaimed as an independent state on August 24th, 1991. Then Filaret convened in the beginning of November of the same year, 1991, a council which requested from Moscow to grant full independence, meaning autocephaly, he meant autocephaly, to the Ukrainian Church. Moscow did not accept the request, but postponed giving solutions to this question to the next local council of the Russian Church. At the Council of Bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate, which was held on April 1st to 2nd in 1992, Filaret promised that he would resign as the Metropolitan of Kiev. When he came back to Ukraine, however, he declared that he made his promise under duress and therefore would not keep it. The Council of Russian Bishops on June 11th of the same year, 1992, defrocked Filaret. He was accused of breaking his promises and inappropriate behavior. 2 weeks before that, on May 27-28, the Council of Bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow met in Kharkiv without Filaret this time. It decided to remove him from his office. New Metropolitan of Kiev was elected to substitute him. It was the Metropolitan of Rostov at the time, Volodymyr Sabodan. Filaret did not recognize the decisions of the councils of both Russian and Ukrainian churches. Instead, he initiated the Old Ukrainian Orthodox Council, which was held on June 25th, 1992. At this council, as it was mentioned, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church under Mstislav Skripnik agreed to merge with the group that remained with Filaret. Together, they established the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Patriarchate of Kiev. Mstislav became the formal leader of this church as its patriarch, while Filaret was his deputy and informal leader. While Mstislav was quite old, Filaret was still very kind of hungry for power, and he effectively managed the church. After Mstislav died in 1993, Volodymyr Romaniuk became his successor as the Patriarch of Kiev. Filaret remained a deputy of Volodymyr, and who was like a screen behind which Filaret remained the real leader of the church. In 1995, after Volodymyr passed away, Filaret was elected the Patriarch of Kiev. In 1997, the Council of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church anathematized Filaret, which is the most severe punishment. Although the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church in 1992 agreed to unite with the group of Filaret, a part of this church soon decided to stay away from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Patriarchate of Kiev, which was formed as a result of the merge. So the merge was not accepted by all people from the Autocephalous Church. And this part that stayed away from the Kiev Patriarchate proceeded with electing in 1993 its own patriarch, Dmytro Yarema, who stayed in the office until he died in 2000. After his death, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church under Dmytro Yarema, which was under Dmytro Yarema, did not merge with the Kiev Patriarchate of Filaret, decided not to elect a new patriarch, but instead to be headed by a metropolitan. Metropolitan Mefodii Kudryakov became the new primate of the church. In 2015, after his death, he was succeeded by Metropolitan Makary Maletich. In result, the Ukrainian Orthodoxy became really fragmented. On the one hand, there was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in unity with the Moscow Patriarchate. Through the latter, it enjoyed communion with the rest of the Orthodox churches globally. On the other hand, there were two churches which global Orthodoxy regarded as schismatic: the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church and the Kiev Patriarchate. There was a little hope for their reconciliation, and an unexpected chance for reconciliation was given by the Russian aggression that followed the Revolution of Dignity in the early 20s. In the wake of the annexation of Crimea and the proxy war in Donbass, the Ukrainian state began considering the ecclesial situation as a national security issue. It realized that the Russian Orthodox Church directly and through its outpost in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church systematically weakened the Ukrainian resistance to the Kremlin and promoted the anti-Ukrainian agenda. Besides this, the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, who became a protagonist of the Ukrainian autocephaly, hoped to improve his popular support in the wake of the upcoming presidential elections in the spring 2019, which he, as we know, eventually lost to Zelensky. Poroshenko went to Istanbul to negotiate with the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. In contrast to 1917, the Ecumenical Patriarchate this time decided to cooperate with the Ukrainian state. After many negotiations with the Ukrainian authorities, the Holy Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, held on October 9 through 11, 2018, declared that the faithful of the non-canonical churches, and I quote the decision of the Synod, have been restored to communion with the Church. End of quote. This declaration meant the end of the schism and the fragmentation that had existed in Ukraine since 1992. The Synod in Constantinople also annulled, and this is important, annulled the document of 1686 that had granted the Church of Moscow temporarily and conditional, according to Constantinople, management of the Metropolia of Kiev. This effectively restored Constantinople's canonical jurisdiction over Ukraine in the form of Kievan Metropolia that had been established in the 10th century. The Ukrainian church became a canonical structure similar to the one that had been established in the 10th century and existed until 1686. The decision of the Ecumenical Patriarchate also meant that Constantinople does not recognize any existing jurisdiction in Ukraine except its own. Both the Kiev Patriarchate and the Autocephalous Church, that didn't want to join it, were supposed to abolish themselves and to establish a new ecclesial group, which would receive recognition and independence from Constantinople. Simultaneously, Constantinople made it clear that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate ceased to exist as well. By the decision of the same synodal session in Constantinople in October 2018, the primates of the Kiev Patriarchate and the Autocephalous Church, Filaret Denisenko and Makary Maletich, respectively, were restored to the ranks they had had before they were deposed by Moscow. Constantinople did this in the frame of its right to entertain appeals from other jurisdictions. It also recognized the consecration of bishops made in the two non-canonical jurisdictions. Following these decisions of Constantinople, the so-called Unifying Council, where the new church was established, took place in the historical St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev on December 15, 2018, under the presidency of a representative of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Well, President Petro Poroshenko was also sitting in the presidium of the council, but of course could not vote there, which did not mean that he could not decide for what was going on. On the eve of the council, the Kiev Patriarchate and the Autocephalous Church disestablished themselves. All their bishops, plus two bishops from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate, took part in the council, now in the new capacity of the bishops of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. At the council, the statute of the new church was adopted, and its new primate elected, Metropolitan Epifani Dumenko. The new church named itself the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. On January 6, 2019, Metropolitan Epifani, accompanied by President Petro Poroshenko, visited Istanbul. At the residence of the Ecumenical Patriarchate Fanar, he received the Tomos for Ukrainian autocephaly. The document was signed by Patriarch Bartholomew and the members of the Holy Synod of the Church of Constantinople. This solemn act finalized the process of granting the Ukrainian Church its canonical independence, meaning autocephaly. So it was like the end of the long, centuries-long story of seeking for independence. Ukrainian Orthodox. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate, quite expectedly, did not accept establishing a new church, and from the beginning demonstrated hostility to it. Well, now it faces a similar kind of hostility firing back, so to say, from the Ukrainian society. So, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, faithful in this policy towards the Autocephalous Church, faithfully followed the line of the Moscow Patriarchate. On September 14, 2018, the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church took a decision, and I quote, to suspend the liturgical, prayerful commemoration of Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, to suspend the concelebration with the hierarchs of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, to suspend the participation of the Russian Orthodox Church in all episcopal assemblies, theological dialogues, multilateral commissions, and other structures chaired or co-chaired by representatives of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. End of quote. On October 15th, the same year, 2018, the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church took a decision to cease Eucharistic communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The decision of the Russian Church was unilateral, which meant that the Church of Constantinople did not follow it. From the perspective of Constantinople, there was any cessation in relations between Constantinople and Moscow. So they perceived that the business was running as usual, no break in communion. The same view was adopted by most other Orthodox churches. The Orthodox world thus found itself in a kind of impasse. Moscow used sticks and carrots, like blackmail and bribes, to keep other Orthodox churches from recognizing the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. In this way, the Russian Orthodox Church tried to undermine the role of Constantinople as primus inter pares, well, meaning this Roman formula, meaning equal among the first among equals, among the Orthodox churches. Constantinople, in its turn, tried to convince other churches to recognize the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Only 3 churches agreed to do so: Alexandria, Cyprus, and Greece. Well, so far. Moscow unilaterally broke relations with them. Moscow also withdrew from all ecumenical dialogues in which these churches participate. This created an kind of, as I said, an impasse in the relations of the global Orthodoxy with the Catholic Church and other Christian churches. These impasses received a chance to be overcome, well, quite paradoxically, after Vladimir Putin waged a fully fledged war against Ukraine in February 2022. So, well, sometimes some new opportunities come from the tragedies like this one. The Russian Orthodox Church, led by Patriarch Kirill Gundyaev, from the very beginning endorsed, as we all know, this war and became one of its leading advocates. This has discredited the Moscow Patriarchate in the global Christian community, so to say, particularly in the West, and delegitimized its claims that had led to the impasse. So essentially, Moscow used its authority to marginalize, to isolate the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the autocephalous Church, in the kind of on the global scene. And after the war started and the Moscow Patriarchate supported the war, this authority diminished dramatically, shrinked. And this gave an opportunity to the autocephalous Church in Ukraine to expand its recognition, so to say. Let me kind of shift my focus briefly on this support of the Russian Church to the war, or to the Russian war against Ukraine. Soon after this war escalated, on March 6th, 2022, meaning like 2 weeks after it was kind of escalated, right? Patriarch Kirill stated that this war, and I quote, has not a physical but metaphysical meaning. In his understanding, the Russian civilization, which he also calls Russian world, holds against the cosmic evil embedded in the Western civilizations. Putin seems to have adopted such an interpretation of his role as a kind of messiah and savior of the world from itself. You know, they've adopted, and I believe they've distorted the original kind of Byzantine political idea that the Byzantium or the Roman Empire was the holder, of the integrity of the world against chaos and disruption from outside world, and the emperors played the role of kind of a holder. In the Byzantine terminology, it was the katechon, of the world against destruction and decay and chaos. So Putin, with the assistance of the church, has adopted the same kind of idea that he is in the center of the world. He holds the world from disruption and chaos and decay, and that is the universal mission of Russia. So he believes, and he believes that he started this war to preserve the world from itself, essentially. This is a crazy idea which could be inspired only by the church. Putin demonstrates all the symptoms of being under the spell of idiocracy, meaning a state of mind when ideas possess a person to the point of completely consuming him or her. Essentially, reason doesn't work for him anymore. Some really strange ideas hold a possession of his mind. I believe that the power of ideas upon Putin's mind is compatible with the power of a religious myth. Well, what kind of myth is it? Putin revealed some aspects of his geopolitical creed. I believe it's difficult to call it other thing than a creed, because it's about religious belief, not rational thinking, you know. And he revealed gradually his mythological kind of thinking through a series of his lectures or sermons that were broadcast to the Russian public through the Russian TV. They started broadcasting them on the eve of the invasion, full-scale invasion, and then he continues preaching those ideas in different encounters with the Russian public. Putin presents an historiosophical concept which features an almost Hegelian dialectical determinism. According to this concept, Russia is like a thesis, you know, in the Hegelian dialectics. West is an antithesis. And Putin envisages Russia and the West as irreconcilable antagonists without chances for synthesis. Well, maybe one could interpret, you know, the German or some European policies regarding Putin in the same Hegelian terms, but some Putin-versteiners, so to say, they believe in the possibility of synthesis between Putin's kind of thesis and the Western antithesis. Putin doesn't believe in this synthesis anymore. Well, let me just make this remark and to render this war of ideas in the terms of Hegelian dialectics. For Putin, nevertheless, the way how he perceives the West is an imaginary construct, far away from reality. His Russia is also imaginary. Well, Russia that he believes in is not real, just as the West is not real. The West that he believes in is not real. And this is because of the long years of isolation in the ivory towers of his palaces. Probably it's because of the, isolation during the COVID pandemic, which also contributed to, to the formation of this mentality in Putin's head. It should be said, nevertheless, that Putin's delusions about both the West and Russia are not his own inventions. They go as far in the past as to the controversy, at least between the so-called Westernizers and Slavophiles, Zapadniki и Slavянофилы, in the 19th century. The latter, meaning Slavophiles, developed the idea about a unique Russian role in the global history of humankind. They rendered this idea in religious terms. Well, I think one of the most gifted speaker on behalf of this group was Fyodor Dostoevsky, who ascribed this kind of belief to one of his characters, Ivan Shatov, in the novel The Possessed. Shatov, The Possessed is Besi, right, in the original title. Shatov, Ivan Shatov in this novel, is a former atheist and now a convert to a sort of religion which features a strange mixture of Christian tenets and political ideologies. He confessed, and I quote from the English translation of Besi, of The Possessed, "I believe in Russia. I believe in the Greek Orthodox Church. I believe in the body of Christ. I believe that the second coming will take place in Russia." However, when asked whether he believes in God, Shatov replied, "I shall believe in God." I believe Putin's beliefs are in some points close to those of Shatov. So Dostoevsky somehow prophetically described many figures in the Putin's entourage, including Putin himself. Because Putin also had some kind of conversion to Christianity without necessarily believing in Jesus Christ. For him, the church is important as a vehicle for a quasi-religious ideology, an instrument to influence masses. that's what he has managed to transform the Russian Orthodox Church to, of course, with the full consent of the latter. Dostoevsky represented a line in the Russian religious philosophy that stressed the Russian uniqueness not only in the terms of spirituality, but also in the terms of political culture. A proponent of the presumably unique Russian political traditions was Ivan Ilyin. While rejecting the idea of hereditary monarchy, he advocated for a dictatorship which should be, and I quote him, national, patriotic, but not at all totalitarian. It should be instead authoritarian, it is educating and revitalizing, end of quote. Being fascinated by the idea of authoritarianism, as he called it, Ilyin endorsed its incarnations in the interwar Germany and Italy. It's interesting that even after the World War II, he still found a lot of useful things in Nazi Germany. No surprise that Putin declared Ilyin as his favorite thinker. Putin was inspired to think along these lines also by the church figures, such as Patriarch Kirill and Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov. Well, sometimes we speak about just Patriarch Kirill as the main protagonist of Putin's support, but there is a bunch of other convinced Putinists, including like people like Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov, who is the bishop in Pskov in the west of Russia. All those Putinists, they believe that, Shevkunov is believed to be Putin's confessor, taking confessions for Putin, which I don't believe. But this kind of public presence of Shevkunov is cultivated. All these figures, they have played a key role in shaping the doctrine of the Russian world, which has become the main ideology in Putin's Russia. This ideology also constitutes the main framework for the ongoing war in Ukraine. The concept of the Russian world, it should be said, existed even before the phrase Russian world was coined. It is a sort of civilizational exceptionalism that has permeated Russian political thinking and Russian culture in general since at least the early modernity. Then the idea of Moscow as the third Rome underlined an assumed special historical mission for the Muscovite state, which eventually grew to an empire. Russian civilizational exceptionalism took a shape of imperialism in the period of Romanov's empire. This period featured internal colonization, which extended primarily to Siberia and other parts of Asia. Ukraine also became an object of Russia's intensive colonizing efforts. During the 18th and 19th centuries, such standard policies of colonization as suppression of native languages, culture, could be identified regarding Ukraine. Similar colonizing efforts continued after the end of the Russian Empire in the Soviet period. The Soviet Union, although rejected the imperial legacy of the Romanovs, effectively continued the imperial traditions of exceptionalism and colonialism. The artificial famine during the early 1930s, known in Ukraine as Holodomor, became the pinnacle of such policies. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian civilizational exceptionalism was reimagined. A new phrase was coined to describe it, the Russian world. That's how the Russian world was brought to the scene, intellectual scene, so to say. I identify four major stages in the evolution, a modern evolution of the concept of the Russian world. The earliest stage can be traced back to the 1990s. Then the phrase Russian world was introduced to the public discourse by the so-called methodologists, methodology. Their roots go back to the 1950s, when the so-called Moscow Logical Coterie, Moskovsky Logический Кружок, was founded by the graduates of the Department of Philosophy at the Lomonosov State University in Moscow. They included such intellectuals as Merab Mabardashvili and Georgy Shchedrovitsky. The latter transformed this initial movement and shaped it in what would become the Moscow Methodological Coterie, Moskovsky Methodologiический Кружок in Russian. Shchedrovitsky's method was epistemological and focused on translating the methods of thinking to the methods of acting, including acting politically. During the 1990s, After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Shchedrovitsky's followers applied his epistemological method to a new political situation and came up with the concept of the Russian world. Well, by the way, it is believed that some people in the presidential office were influenced in their younger years, were influenced by these ideas, including Sergei Kirienko, who is like curating, the Ukraine, one of the curators of the Ukraine policy in the Kremlin. However, initially the Russian world was perceived as a part of the world's diversity. It was not a bad thing as such, I would say. This world was envisaged as contributing to the global humanity by offering its best, primarily its creativity. The Russian world at this initial stage was seen not as better than other worlds, but equal to them. In other words, it was perceived in universalist and inclusivist and not particularist and exclusivist terms. It was designed as an instrument of liberalization and democratization of Russia because, as the methodologists believed, Russia could contribute creatively to the global civilization only as a democratic and liberal state. At this stage, the idea of the Russian world was confined to a narrow circle of intellectuals, however. So it was really a very tiny group that discussed this idea of the Russian world. It was elitist and did not appeal to the masses. By far, it was not, in any sense, a mass ideology. The second stage of the evolution of the Russian world doctrine was marked by a rather radical U-turn. From contributing to the global civilization as an equal partner, the Russian world began to be perceived as a distinct and, in many points, superior civilization. It ceased to be seen as Western-like, but began to be imagined as uniquely Russian or Eurasian. At this stage, it converged with the long Russian tradition of civilizational exceptionalism. It also converged with the concept of sovereign democracy, which was coined in 2006 and defined the second term of Vladimir Putin's presidency from 2004 through 2008. On the one hand, it was some kind of democracy. On the other, it was not like the Western democracies, but increasingly sovereign, meaning autarkic, and not accountable to anything or anyone, both inside and outside Russia. At this point, the Kremlin became interested in the Russian world concept, which began to be discussed in various official and semi-official think tanks. A marginal Russian thinker, Alexander Dugin, became a part of these discussions, but his influence on the formation of this ideology is rather limited. The doctrine of the Russian world remained elitist and a sort of intellectual game. Most of the Russian population could not comprehend or identify themselves with it. I would argue that even Dugin sometimes could not understand himself, what he was talking about. Not to say about the Russian, an average Russian somewhere in the Russian province. At the third stage, the Russian Orthodox Church stepped in and geared up the evolution of the doctrine of the Russian world. This happened in the last years of the tenure of Alexei II as the Patriarch. He died in 2008. And the true demiurge of this new concept of the Russian world was Metropolitan Kirill of Smolensk and Kaliningrad. He became the Patriarch of Moscow in 2010, and he fully invested himself into this doctrine and became its main ambassador and spokesperson. Owing to the Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Russian world ideology received a metaphysical, eschatological, and a messianic spin. It was rendered as a unique treasury of the so-called traditional values, of family values, and an anti-liberal and anti-globalist stronghold. At this stage of its evolution, the doctrine of the Russian world turned even more exclusivist, particularist, and less tolerant to diversity. At the same time, it became widely popular among the ordinary Russians. The mainstream Russian media began propagating it across all strata of the Russian society. So I would argue that the role that the church played in propelling the Russian world ideology was double. One part of it was to kind of reshape, rethink the Russian world ideology, and the second part was to make it really a mass ideology for masses and not just for elites. And the Kremlin accepted this ideology as eventually as its mainstream ideology and started speaking about the Russian world using the vocabulary elaborated upon by the church. This doctrine became Russia's soft power initially. However, this power grew increasingly harder as the Russian regime turned to be more authoritarian. Such a transformation of the doctrine was catalyzed by the events of the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, which happened, as we know, in the winter 2013-14. The Kremlin perceived it as Ukraine's attempt to leave the Russian orbit and an existential threat to the integrity of the Russian world, of which Ukraine, so they believed in Russia, was an intrinsic part. To neutralize this imagined threat, in February 2014, Russia waged a war in Ukraine which continues to our days. That's why in Ukraine, as you know, we prefer that in February 22 the war did not start, it just escalated. But the war started in February 2014. Since then, the Russian world doctrine has become the main source of narratives justifying this war and inspiring people to fight for its cause. The Russian military advances in 2014 halted after the Ukrainian resistance and international efforts with the help of the so-called Minsk agreements. In unoccupied Ukraine, the Russian aggression became explicitly associated with the Russian world doctrine. This endangered the existence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, which became associated with the Russian world ideology. This church is perceived by both the Kremlin and the Moscow Patriarchate as an important asset, as an instrument of influence, and they did not want to lose this asset then in 2014. If the speakers of the Moscow Patriarchate continued using the rhetoric of the Russian world, they would increase the pressure on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the Ukrainian state and society after 2014. To avoid such a pressure, they ceased referring to the Russian world. So essentially, we are observing a very interesting phenomenon that in 2014, a lot of words were said regarding the Russian world ideology from the Russian Church. Then, after 2015, they stopped talking, referring to the Russian world. And my explanation to that is they wanted to preserve this asset of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. And that's why they stopped talking about the Russian world, because it would be kind of affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. However, it does not mean that the speakers and thinkers in the Russian Orthodox Church abandoned this doctrine per se. It remained somewhere in the back of their minds. Nevertheless, there was a pause. Nevertheless, this doctrine reimagined in the official rhetoric of the Moscow Patriarchate after the escalation of the Russian violence against Ukraine in February 2022. The fully scaled Russian intrusion was condemned by the international community. The metaphysical component in the justification of this intrusion was addressed in several declarations. One of them, a declaration on the Russian world teaching, was published on March 13, 2022, and signed by around 1,500 theologians worldwide. This declaration became viral and was cited in many media. It also triggered responses from the Russian Orthodox Church. First, the official speaker of the church, Alexander Shipkov, published on May 13, 2022, an article, "The Russification of a Theological War." In this article, he rebuked the declaration and offered fresh arguments in the justification of the Russian world. So then, the rhetoric of the Russian world re-emerged in the public addresses by the official speakers of the Russian Church. This was the first time that this doctrine was referred to by a church official after a long time. Soon after this publication, Patriarch Kirill personally made a statement in support of the Russian world. He said in his address on May 23rd that I quote, "The Russian world is again becoming a forefront of the Christian civilization." End of quote. This coming back of the rhetoric supporting the Russian world marks the fourth stage of the evolution of this doctrine. It is the most violent and exclusivist form that this doctrine ever demonstrated. in contrast even to the third stage, which acknowledged some rights for the Ukrainian people and their culture to exist, the fourth stage completely denies any such right. Now Ukraine is just an anti-Russian fantasy that deserves only to be eliminated. Timofey Sergeytsev, who is associated with the school of methodologists, Shedrovitsky's, this kind of philosophical circle, made a blunt statement regarding this in his article What Russia Must Do to Ukraine, published by the state news agency RIA Novosti on April 3rd, 2022. And this was an important statement, which I quote: "A denazified country, meaning Ukraine, cannot be sovereign. The name Ukraine apparently cannot be retained as the title of any fully denazified state entity on a territory liberated from the Nazi regime." This is the end of quote, which meant that Sergeytsev clearly proclaimed that in the name of the Russian world they need to eliminate Ukraine altogether. At this terminal fourth stage of its evolution, the Russian world reached the extreme degree of exceptionalism and exclusivism. This degree can be probably compared only with the same degree in Nazi Germany. Similarly to the latter, the Russian world has become uniforming, monolithic, monopolizing, and eliminating any diversity, and be it cultural, political, or religious. The fact that the Moscow Patriarchate has endorsed the doctrine of the Russian world and the war that this doctrine underpins, as it was mentioned, has alienated many Christian churches from the Russian Orthodox Church. Pope Francis famously called Patriarch Kirill Putin's altar boy, which was a token of such alienation among the Catholics. Among the Orthodox, Patriarch Bartholomew pioneered criticism. For example, speaking at the World Policy Conference for a Reasonably Open World in Abu Dhabi in December last year, he bluntly criticized the doctrine of the Russian world and how religion has been instrumentalized in Putin's Russia. Such accusations mark a turning point in the attitude of the global Christianity to the Russian Orthodox Church, which, because of its involvement in the war, is becoming marginalized and weakened. As a result, the impasses this church has created can also be resolved soon. Moscow Patriarchate's involvement in the war has even more alienated the Ukrainian Orthodox from what they used to see as their mother church, so to say. Even the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate decided to hide all its connections with Moscow. On May 27th, 2022, last year, it held a council where it eliminated from its statute all references to the Russian Orthodox Church. This did not make this church completely independent from Moscow yet. It is autocephalous or even autonomous in the terms that I described earlier, but certainly it was a step towards such an independence. Those communities in this church which think that it does not do enough to distance itself from Moscow, increasingly choose to switch to the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I would conclude my presentation by claiming that Vladimir Putin is really a master, on the one hand, a master of cracks. On the other hand, he inflicts most damage to himself and what he pretends to protect. Thus, he skillfully finds cracks in what he believes to be his enemies' camps and then tries to widen them further for his political ends. It has become common wisdom that he tried and continues to be hopeful, actually, to crack the unity of the West, including the NATO. Sometimes it felt like he was not far from success, but then we see, because of the Ukrainian resistance to the Russian aggression, the integrity of the West and the NATO is being restored. In trying to widen the cracks in his enemy's camps, Putin uses not just hard powers like the Russian army, but also soft powers, including the church. He uses Russia's soft powers to weaken his enemies. These powers include language, culture, and faith. Putin does not hide that they are instrumental for expanding Russia's influence globally. In the spirit of such instrumentalization, the Russian Orthodox Church broke relations with some other Orthodox churches, blocked the dialogue with the Catholic, Lutheran, and other churches, tried to further alienate Ukrainian churches from each other. At the same time, this strategy of cracking down enemies backfires. In the wake of the war, which Russia seems to be losing, both the Russian state and church face uncertain future. Internal divisions inside the Moscow Patriarchate are growing. Most of them are unseen yet, especially inside Russia, but they are happening. Outside Russia, some structures of the Moscow Patriarchate increasingly distance themselves from Moscow, and some have broken up. The example of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate has been already mentioned. Other parts of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad also began seeking to distance themselves from Moscow. The Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, Rokor, which in 2007 had reunited with the Moscow Patriarchate through the mediation of Vladimir Putin, experiences pressure from some of its faithful to disconnect from the Moscow Patriarchate. Some communities of the Moscow Patriarchate, such as the one in Amsterdam, and groups of priests, such as in Lithuania, abandon Moscow and join other jurisdictions, primarily the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The Russian Orthodox Church is also rapidly losing its credibility in the Russian society. I would say that this process of disintegration of the Russian Church, they mirror similar process of political disintegration of Russia, of the Russian elites, from the top level to down level. We probably cannot see this disintegration yet well, but I believe it is happening, and it will lead to some more explicit processes of disintegration. Well, thank you for your patience with me, for bearing with me with this long survey packed with facts and dates. I will be happy to answer your questions if you have any.
Okay, thank you very much for this extremely detailed and analytical account. I will immediately open the floor for questions.